On February 17, 1978, at 3:40 in the afternoon, Michael Brennan walked across the frozen surface of Lake Michigan near the small town of Saugatuck and left behind a trail of footprints that ended at the water's edge. The prints stopped abruptly, as if he had simply stepped off the face of the earth. 15 months later, he appeared 700 miles away in a field outside Pittsfield, Massachusetts, wearing clothes he didn't recognize and carrying a backpack he couldn't explain, with absolutely no memory of where he had been. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Michael Brennan was 23 years old in the winter of '78, a senior at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, 9 credits short graduating with a degree in history. His roommate, David Chun, remembered him as energetic, curious, someone who asked too many questions in class and spent his free time reading books that weren't assigned. He had taken a year off to study in Germany, come back with better language skills and a restlessness that made him skip classes to drive to places he'd never been. His professors tolerated him because he always showed up for exams and scored higher than students who attended every lecture. There was nothing in his behavior that suggested instability. He paid his rent on time. He called his mother every Sunday. He had plans for spring break. The morning he disappeared was a Saturday. There was fresh snow on the ground, nearly 8 inches, and the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees overnight. Michael told his roommate he was going cross-country skiing near Saugatuck, a stretch of shoreline he had visited before. He packed his skis, a small backpack with water and trail mix, and left the apartment around noon. David remembered watching him load the car and thinking nothing of it. Michael did this sort of thing all the time. He would be gone for a day, maybe 2, and then come back with stories about what he'd seen or some odd conversation he'd had with a stranger at a gas station. When Michael didn't return by Sunday evening, David assumed he had decided to stay another night. When he didn't return by Monday morning, David started to worry. He called Michael's parents in Ohio. They hadn't heard from him. He called the college administration. No one had seen him. By Monday afternoon, David filed a missing person report with the local police department, and by Tuesday morning, a search had begun. Snowmobilers found his skis and backpack on Tuesday afternoon. The items were lying in the snow about 200 yards from the shoreline, in an area that had already been searched once. The backpack was zip closed. The skis were positioned neatly, poles resting beside them, as if someone had carefully set them down rather than abandoned them in panic. But what investigators found more troubling was the trail of footprints leading away from the equipment. The prints moved in a straight line toward the lake, crossing the beach and continuing out onto the ice. They continued for another 200 yards, clear and evenly spaced, until they reached a section of frozen water near the edge of a known deep channel. Then they stopped. There were no returning prints, no signs of a struggle, no broken ice, just the empty expanse of white snow and the flat gray surface of the frozen lake. The official explanation came quickly. Michael Brennan had fallen through the ice. The lake in that area was known for weak spots, places where the current underneath prevented a solid freeze. He had likely broken through, been pulled under by the cold water, and his body had been carried away by the current beneath the ice sheet. It was a tragic accident, but it made sense. People died this way every winter in Michigan. The search and rescue teams conducted an aerial survey and checked the immediate area, but the ice was too unstable to conduct a thorough ground search. They would wait until spring when the ice melted and sweep the lake for remains. His family accepted the explanation because there was no alternative. His mother held a small memorial service in Ohio. His father packed up his belongings from the apartment. The college awarded him a posthumous degree, a gesture of respect for a student who had been so close to finishing. His friends grieved, then gradually moved on. By summer, when the ice had melted and the lake had been searched with sonar equipment and divers, no body was found. The authorities suggested the current had carried him farther than expected, perhaps into deeper water where recovery would be impossible. The case was quietly closed. But there was something the investigators hadn't mentioned in their public statements, something that only appeared in the internal report. The footprints leading out onto the ice were consistent in depth and spacing, suggesting a calm, deliberate walk. There were no drag marks. No signs that Michael had stumbled or fallen, and the prints ended in an area where the ice, when later tested, was nearly 6 inches thick, solid enough to support the weight of a full-grown man. One of the search and rescue coordinators, a man named Gerald Foster, who had worked these lakes for over 20 years, noted in his report that the pattern didn't match a typical drowning scenario. When someone falls through ice, there are usually signs: broken edges, scattered snow, handprints where the person tried to pull themselves out. There was none of that. Foster wrote in his notes that the scene looked staged, but he couldn't explain why someone would stage their own disappearance in the middle of winter on a frozen lake. The report was filed. No one followed up. 15 months later, on May 5, 1979, a woman named June Brennan was working in her kitchen in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find a young man standing on her porch, thin and sunburned, wearing a faded blue jacket she didn't recognize and jeans that looked too big for him. He had shaggy brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. For a moment, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Then recognition hit her like a physical blow. It was her nephew Michael. He had been declared dead 14 months earlier. She had attended his memorial service. She had sent flowers to his mother. And now he was standing in front of her, alive, looking at her as if he had simply stopped by to visit. She said his name, a question more than a statement, and he nodded. He said he didn't know how he got there. He said the last thing he remembered was standing on the shore of Lake Michigan, looking out at the ice, and then waking up in a field about 3 miles from her house. He had walked to the nearest road, recognized the area because he had visited her before, and made his way to her home. June brought him inside and called his parents. Within hours, the house was full of people. His father drove up from Ohio. Local police arrived to take a statement. Reporters, somehow alerted to the story, gathered outside with cameras. And through it all, Michael sat at the kitchen table and told the same story over and over, his voice calm, his answers consistent, but offering no real explanation for where he had been. He said he woke up lying in the grass in an empty field. The sun was up, and it was warm, which confused him because the last thing he remembered was cold. He was wearing clothes he had never seen before. The blue jacket, the jeans, a T-shirt with a logo from a marathon in Wisconsin, a race he had never run. Next to him was a backpack, also unfamiliar, filled with items that made no sense. Hand-drawn maps of routes through several states. Cardboard signs with the word East written in marker. A pair of glasses that weren't his prescription. $40 in cash. He had no injuries, no signs of malnutrition or dehydration. He was sunburned, suggesting he'd been outside for an extended period, but he was otherwise healthy. His weight was nearly the same as it had been when he disappeared. Medical examinations conducted later that week found nothing unusual. No signs of drug use. No evidence of trauma. His cognitive function was normal. He could remember everything from before February 17th, 1978. He knew his family, his friends, his coursework. But the 15 months between his disappearance and his reappearance were completely blank. The police interviewed him for hours, trying to find inconsistencies in his story or clues about where he might have been. They asked about the clothes. He didn't know. They asked about the maps. He didn't recognize the handwriting. They asked about the marathon T-shirt. He had never been to Wisconsin during the time frame when that race would have taken place. They asked if he had any enemies, anyone who might have wanted to harm him or hold him captive. He said no. They asked if he'd been planning to leave, if there were problems in his life that might have made him want to disappear. He said no. The investigators ran his fingerprints through every database they could access. They checked hospitals, homeless shelters, arrest records. They contacted police departments in Wisconsin, in every state between Michigan and Massachusetts. They found nothing. No record of Michael Brennan existing anywhere during those 15 months. One detail troubled the lead detective, a woman named Sarah Novak. The backpack Michael had been carrying contained maps that showed specific routes through Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The routes were marked in red pen, with notations about distances and estimated travel times. The handwriting was neat, methodical, suggesting someone who was planning a long journey on foot or by hitchhiking. But Michael insisted he had no memory of writing anything. He didn't recognize the handwriting as his own, though a forensic analysis later confirmed it was a likely match. The map suggested he had been traveling, moving deliberately from one place to another, but he had no explanation for why or where he was going. Detective Novak noted something else in her report. When she asked Michael if he had any theory about what happened to him, any speculation at all, he hesitated before answering. He said he didn't know, but the hesitation was noticeable. It was the only moment during the interview when he seemed uncertain, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. The case should have generated national attention. A young man vanishes without a trace, presumed dead, then reappears over a year later with no memory of where he's been. It was the kind of story that made headlines, but the coverage was surprisingly brief. A few local news outlets ran pieces about the strange return, but the story faded within weeks. Michael gave one interview to a regional newspaper, repeating the same account he had given to the police, and then stopped speaking to reporters. He told his family he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He said he just wanted to move forward. His parents respected his wishes, but they had questions. His mother asked him once if he thought someone had taken him, held him somewhere against his will. He said he didn't think so. She asked if he felt safe now, if he was afraid. He said no. She asked if he had any dreams or flashes of memory, anything that might help explain what happened. He said no. But again, there was that hesitation, that brief moment where it seemed like he was holding something back. Michael moved back to Ohio and tried to rebuild his life. He took a job at a local library. He avoided large crowds and declined invitations to social events. His friends from college reached out, but he rarely responded. He became, in the words of one former classmate, a ghost of the person he used to be, not because he was traumatized or withdrawn, but because he seemed fundamentally changed, quieter, more careful about what he said. In 1982, a private investigator named Leonard Shaw became interested in the case. Shaw had worked missing persons cases for over 20 years and had seen patterns that others missed. He started digging into the details of Michael's disappearance, not because anyone had hired him, but because something about the story didn't add up. He obtained copies of the police reports, interviewed the original investigators, and traveled to Saugatuck to examine the site where Michael had vanished. Shaw found the same inconsistencies that Gerald Foster had noted 3 years earlier. The footprints didn't match a drowning. The ice was too thick. And there was another detail that hadn't been widely reported. 2 days before Michael disappeared, a local hardware store owner in Saugatuck recalled a young man matching his description purchasing a large backpack, a compass, and several rolls of heavy-duty plastic sheeting. The store owner remembered the transaction because the young man paid in cash and seemed preoccupied, barely speaking during the purchase. When shown a photograph of Michael, the store owner said it could have been him, but he couldn't be certain. Shaw also discovered something else. In the weeks before Michael's disappearance, there had been several reports of strangers in the area, men in their 30s and 40s who were seen near the college campus and in Saugatuck, asking questions about local students. The reports were vague and had never been investigated thoroughly, dismissed at the time as unrelated to Michael's case. But Shaw found pattern. The strangers had been asking specifically about students who were vocal, politically active, the kind of young people who questioned authority. Michael had been one of those students. He had participated in protests against the Vietnam War. He had written editorials for the college newspaper criticizing government policies. He had attended meetings of groups that advocated for social change. None of this had seemed relevant to his disappearance, but Shaw began to wonder if it might have been. Shaw tried to interview Michael, but Michael refused. He said he had nothing to add to what he had already told the police. He said he appreciated Shaw's interest, but didn't want to revisit the past. Shaw respected his decision, but couldn't shake the feeling that Michael knew more than he was saying. In his final report, Shaw wrote that he believed Michael's disappearance had been voluntary, that he had left Michigan for reasons he chose not to disclose, and that the 15 months he spent away had been intentional. But Shaw also noted that this theory didn't explain the lack of memory, the unfamiliar clothes, or the strange items in the backpack. Over the years, theories emerged. Some people believe Michael had been abducted by a group operating in the area, possibly involved in human trafficking or coerced labor. Others thought he had suffered a mental breakdown, wandered for months in a dissociative state, and eventually found his way back. A few suggested he had been involved in something illegal, had gone underground to avoid consequences, and later fabricated the memory loss to avoid questions. None of these theories could be proven. One theory that gained traction, particularly in the decades after his reappearance, was that Michael had been recruited by a government agency or clandestine organization. The timeline of his disappearance coincided with a period when intelligence agencies were known to be conducting covert operations, recruiting young people for missions that required them to disappear from their normal lives. The marked maps, the methodical travel, the lack of any official record of his existence during those 15 months, all pointed to something organized, something deliberately hidden. But again, there was no evidence. Just speculation. Michael Brennan refused to discuss the case publicly after the early 80s. He married in 1985, had 2 children, and worked quietly in Ohio for the rest of his life. He never granted another interview. When reporters contacted him on anniversaries of his disappearance, he politely declined to comment. He told friends that he had moved on and wanted to be left alone. In 2003, he passed away from a heart attack at the age of 48. His obituary made no mention of his disappearance or the mystery that had surrounded his return. But the case didn't die with him. In recent years, a new generation of investigators has revisited the evidence, using modern technology to analyze the original reports and search for connections that might have been missed. They have found nothing new. The backpack, the maps, the clothes Michael was wearing when he reappeared were all lost or discarded years ago. The police reports are incomplete, missing key documents that were either misfiled or deliberately removed. And the people who knew Michael, who might have had insights into what really happened, are now dead or unwilling to speak. What remains is a collection of facts that don't quite fit together. A man who walked onto a frozen lake and vanished. Footprints that ended where they shouldn't have. A reappearance 15 months later, 700 miles away, with no explanation. Items that suggested travel and planning, but no memory to confirm it, and a refusal to provide answers, even when pressed. The question that haunts this case is not whether Michael knew where he had been. The question is why he chose not to tell. Detective Sarah Novak, now retired, was interviewed in 2010 about the case. She said she had always believed Michael remembered more than he admitted. She said she respected his right to privacy. But she also felt there was a moral obligation to provide answers when a disappearance generates so much public concern and consumes so many resources. She said she thought about the case often, particularly the moment during the interview when Michael hesitated. She said she believed he was protecting someone or something, but she didn't know what. One possibility, rarely discussed, is that Michael's disappearance was part of a larger event, something involving other people who were never identified. In the months after he reappeared, there were a handful of similar cases across the Midwest. Young men and women who vanished for extended periods, then returned with stories of memory loss or incomplete explanations. None of the cases were connected officially, but the similarities were striking. The age range, the timing, the lack of physical harm, and the consistent refusal to provide details. A journalist named Ellen Torres investigated these cases in the early 2000s, publishing a series of articles that suggested a pattern. She interviewed families, reviewed police reports, and found at least 7 cases between 1976 and 1982 that shared common elements with Michael's disappearance. In every case, the person who returned refused to discuss where they had been. In every case, there were signs of deliberate travel, items that suggested planning, but no concrete explanation. Torres theorized that these individuals had been involved in something they could not or would not disclose, possibly something political, possibly something covert. Her articles generated some interest, but no new leads. The families of the other missing individuals declined to cooperate, stating they wanted to move forward and not revisit painful memories. Law enforcement agencies claimed they had investigated thoroughly at the time and found no connections between the cases. Torres dropped the story and moved on to other work. The pattern she identified remains unexplained. What we know about Michael Brennan is limited to what he chose to share. He was a young man with a promising future who walked onto a frozen lake in February and didn't come back for over a year. When he did return, he offered no answers, only a blank space where 15 months of his life should have been. He lived the rest of his life quietly, raising a family, working a normal job, never seeking attention or offering explanations. He took whatever he knew to his grave. What we don't know is far more extensive. We don't know where he went. We don't know how he survived. We don't know why he came back. We don't know who, if anyone, helped him during those months. We don't know if his disappearance was voluntary or forced. We don't know what he was protecting or what he feared would happen if he told the truth. And perhaps most troubling, we don't know how many others are out there, people who vanish and return with the same silence, the same refusal to explain, the same deliberate erasure of a portion of their lives. Michael's story is not unique, but it is one of the clearest examples of a person choosing silence over disclosure. Whether that choice was made to protect himself, to protect others, or to protect something larger is a question we may never answer. What remains is the uncomfortable reality that someone can disappear, return, and maintain a secret so completely that not even their family can uncover it. The physical evidence told its own fragmented story. The backpack Michael carried was eventually donated to a local museum in Pittsfield, where it sat in storage for nearly 20 years. The curator who found it recognized it from old news coverage. She contacted Michael's family, thinking they might want to return, but they declined. The maps inside showed routes covering over 2,000 miles, with stops in small towns across the Midwest. Some towns had notations in the margins. Safe. Avoid. Contact. The earliest marked location was in central Illinois, hundreds of miles from Lake Michigan. The glasses found in the backpack were never explained. They were a different prescription than what Michael had worn before, suggesting his vision had changed during the time he was gone. But there was no record of him visiting an optometrist anywhere in the country during those 15 months. Someone had provided him with new glasses, which many had been with people, in places where he could receive care. The Wisconsin Marathon T-shirt was traced to a race held in October of 1978, 8 months after Michael disappeared. The shirt showed signs of wear, as if it had been used frequently. Michael's name was not on the participant list. Someone at that race had given him that shirt, but attempts to identify who led nowhere. Detective Novak spent years thinking about the timeline. If Michael had traveled from Michigan to Massachusetts over 15 months, he would have needed food, shelter, money. He would have interacted with people, left traces. But no one ever came forward to say they had seen him or helped him. There was one witness, though her testimony was never considered reliable. In 1980, a woman named Patricia Glenn contacted police, claiming she had seen Michael in November of '78 at Pennsylvania rest area. She said he was sitting alone, eating from a paper bag, writing in a notebook with intense focus. She approached and asked if he was okay. He looked up, seemed startled, and told her he was fine. Months later, when she saw news of his reappearance, she recognized him, but by then, too much time had passed to verify her account. Michael's family struggled with his silence for years. His younger sister, Rebecca, tried multiple times to get him to open up. She believed he had been involved in something dangerous, that his silence was a condition of staying alive. But Michael never confirmed or denied her theories. When she pushed too hard, he would change the subject or leave the room. Rebecca said the hardest part wasn't the not knowing. It was watching her brother live with the weight of whatever he was carrying. She said he seemed burdened not by trauma, but by responsibility, as if he was keeping a promise to someone. She hoped that after he was gone, some record would surface that would explain what he couldn't say in life. But when he died in 2003, no such document was found. In 2007, a man named Thomas Rigby was arrested in Ohio for fraud. During his interrogation, he made an offhand comment about knowing people who had gone underground in the late 70s, part of what he called a network. When pressed, he became vague, saying only that there had been groups helping young people disappear when they needed to. He said he didn't know names, just that it had happened. One investigator, familiar with Michael's case, asked Rigby if he had heard of anyone disappearing near Lake Michigan. Rigby paused, then said he didn't recall specifics, but he knew there were exits in Michigan, places where people could leave their old lives behind. He wouldn't elaborate. Rigby died in prison 3 years later. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence. In a world where almost everything leaves a trace, Michael's 15 months produced nothing. No bank withdrawals. No hospital visits. No employment records. It was as if he had stepped outside the systems that define modern existence. This level of invisibility required deliberate assistance. One person traveling alone could not avoid detection for 15 months without help. There had to have been places where he stayed, people who provided food and shelter. But if such a network existed, it maintained absolute secrecy. Not one person involved ever came forward. And Michael, the one person who could have provided answers, chose not to. His silence was absolute, maintained until his death, and enforced with discipline that suggested it was not born of fear, but a conviction. In the decades since, others have tried to find answers. Documentaries have been proposed, but without cooperation from the family or new evidence, they go nowhere. Podcasts have covered the case, but they can only rehash the same known facts and arrive at the same dead ends. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, because the truth would unravel something larger. Or perhaps Michael's silence was a final act of control, ensuring that his life remained his own. What we are left with is a hole in time. 15 months that existed but remained blank. And a man who walked away from one life, lived another in the spaces between, and returned to tell no one about it. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. But the questions remain unanswered, waiting for someone who might finally be willing to speak. If you know anything about Michael Brennan's disappearance, or if you encountered similar stories, share them below. Some silences are louder than any explanation could ever be.